Part 1 At the birth of a flying tank. In the early years of the Second World War, when the eastern skies trembled under the thunder of artillery and the roar of engines, the Soviet Union faced a brutal reality. German armored divisions were tearing across the vast plains of Eastern Europe with terrifying speed. Columns of tanks, armored vehicles, and supply trucks stretched for kilometers across dusty roads and frozen fields. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg doctrine depended on speed, coordination, and relentless forward momentum. To stop that momentum required more than courage, it required a weapon capable of striking directly at the steel heart of the German war machine. Soviet engineers had already begun developing such a weapon before the war began. The aircraft was unlike anything that had flown before. Designed not for graceful dogfights in the high sky but for brutal work at treetop level, it was built around a revolutionary idea: armor as structure. Instead of attaching armor plates to a conventional airframe, the designers created a protective shell of hardened steel that formed the core of the aircraft itself. This armored bathtub protected the pilot, engine, and fuel systems from small arms fire and even anti-aircraft rounds. The result was an aircraft that could absorb punishment that would tear ordinary fighters apart. When the machine finally entered combat, Soviet soldiers quickly gave it a name that captured both its power and resilience: the flying tank. Officially it was the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, a ground attack aircraft designed to hunt tanks, artillery, and armored convoys. But to the soldiers watching from the trenches below, it was something more. It was a guardian descending from the clouds, a mechanical beast that roared low over the battlefield before unleashing rockets, bombs, and cannon fire with devastating precision. The aircraft itself looked almost brutal in its design. Its broad wings carried heavy armament and allowed it to remain stable even at extremely low altitudes. The cockpit sat buried within the armored fuselage like the command chamber of a fortress. From the ground, the Sturmovik often appeared suddenly, emerging from behind trees or hills at terrifying speed. The sound of its engine was deep and relentless, echoing across the battlefield like the approach of thunder. For Soviet ground troops, the arrival of the Sturmovik often meant survival. When German tanks advanced toward their positions, the distant silhouette of an Il-2 diving toward the enemy could transform despair into hope. Pilots flew into storms of anti-aircraft fire, skimming fields and rivers just meters above the ground. They knew the risks. They knew many of them would not return. But the mission was simple: destroy the enemy where it is hurt most: its armor, its vehicles, its supply lines. By the time the war reached its darkest moments, the Il-2 had already begun to carve its legend into the frozen soil of the Eastern Front. It was not just an aircraft. It was a weapon built for a war of survival. Part 2: A Baptism by Fire. The first months of combat revealed both the terrifying power and the deadly vulnerability of the Il-2. War rarely unfolds according to design, and the Sturmovik's early deployments came during one of the most chaotic periods in Soviet history. The German invasion had shattered front lines, destroyed airfields, and forced Soviet pilots to fight under desperate conditions. Aircraft were sometimes assembled hurriedly and flown into battle within hours. Despite these challenges, the Il-2 quickly proved its worth. Unlike fighters that engaged enemy aircraft high above the battlefield, Sturmovik pilots fought close enough to see the expressions on the faces of soldiers below. They attacked trains, artillery batteries, supply trucks, and armored columns with brutal efficiency. Rockets streaked toward tanks. Cannons ripped through thin armor. Bombs exploded across narrow roads crowded with vehicles. Yet the battlefield was never forgiving. Early versions of the aircraft carried only a single pilot. While the armored shell protected the front and sides of the cockpit, the rear remained vulnerable. German fighter pilots soon realized that attacking from behind offered the best chance of bringing down the Soviet aircraft. Luftwaffe fighters swooped in like predators, striking the Sturmovik's exposed tail before vanishing again into the sky. Losses were heavy. Pilots often returned with aircraft riddled with bullet holes, entire sections of wing torn by shrapnel. Mechanics would patch the machines overnight, hammering armor plates back into shape and replacing damaged control cables. At dawn the aircraft would return to the sky, scarred but still deadly. Stories spread among Soviet troops of Sturmoviks that returned home despite damage that seemed impossible to survive. Some aircraft landed with hundreds of bullet holes. Others flew with entire panels missing from their wings. The armor that made the aircraft heavy also made it resilient. Where other planes would have disintegrated, the Il-2 endured. German soldiers soon developed their own nickname for the aircraft, Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. When the distinctive silhouette appeared overhead, convoys scattered and anti-aircraft guns opened fire in desperation. But the Sturmovik pilots pressed forward, diving again and again toward the enemy. Eventually Soviet engineers made a crucial modification. A rear gunner position was added to later variants of the aircraft. The second crew member operated a machine gun to defend against attacking fighters. This change dramatically increased survivability and turned the Sturmovik into an even more formidable weapon. From that moment onward, the Il-2 became not only a symbol of Soviet resistance but one of the most feared aircraft of the entire war. Part 3A Hunters of Steel. By 1943 the Il-2 had become an essential weapon of the Soviet war effort. Factories across the Soviet Union worked tirelessly to produce more of these armored attackers. Entire assembly lines operated day and night despite shortages of materials and constant relocation away from advancing German forces. The scale of production was staggering. Eventually more than 36,000 Sturmoviks would be built, making it the most produced military aircraft in history. But numbers alone did not explain the aircraft's impact. Its true strength lay in its role on the battlefield. The Il-2 was not designed to chase enemy fighters across the sky. It was built for something far more terrifying, the systematic destruction of armored warfare. German armored columns were the backbone of their offensive operations. Tanks like the Panzer III and Panzer IV led advances while supply vehicles carried fuel and ammunition behind them. Destroy the vehicles, and the entire offensive could collapse. Soviet commanders quickly learned to deploy Sturmovik formations precisely against these vulnerable targets. Flying in groups of 6, 12, or even larger formations, the aircraft would approach at low altitude to avoid detection. Then they would rise slightly, align their attack runs, and dive toward the target. Rockets screamed through the air. Cannons hammered relentlessly. Bombs detonated along narrow roads packed with vehicles. German soldiers described the experience as chaos from the sky. Convoys that had been moving in perfect formation moments before suddenly became infernos of burning fuel and shattered steel. Tanks were disabled, trucks overturned, ammunition exploded in chain reactions. The Il-2's heavy armament was perfectly suited to this brutal work. Its cannons could penetrate armored vehicles. Its rockets could shatter columns of trucks and artillery pieces. And its ability to fly extremely low allowed pilots to target individual vehicles with remarkable precision. In some battles the aircraft attacked repeatedly until entire armored divisions were slowed or mobilized. Ground commanders coordinated with the pilots through radio communications and visual signals. When Soviet infantry encountered strong resistance, they would often call for Sturmovik support. To the soldiers on the ground, the arrival of the aircraft meant sudden, overwhelming firepower descending from above. The sky itself seemed to turn into a weapon. Part 4 of the pilots of the storm. Behind every Sturmovik was a crew who understood the terrifying odds of their mission. Flying at low altitude made them vulnerable not only to enemy fighters but to machine guns, anti-aircraft cannons, and even rifle fire from soldiers below. Each attack run demanded extraordinary courage and concentration. Many of the pilots were young, barely in their 20s. Some had learned to fly only months before being sent to the front. They were trained quickly, often under harsh conditions, and then thrown into one of the most dangerous roles of the war. Yet within these squadrons grew a unique brotherhood. Pilots trusted one another completely. They flew in tight formations, watching each other's blind spots and coordinating attacks with silent precision. A single mistake could mean disaster, but together they could strike with devastating effect. Among these aviators emerged legendary figures whose courage became part of Soviet wartime mythology. Some flew hundreds of combat missions set an almost unimaginable number given the danger of each sortie. They learned to read the battlefield like a living map, anticipating anti-aircraft fire and maneuvering through explosions with astonishing skill. The rear gunners, introduced in later versions of the aircraft, played an equally critical role. Their position was exposed and dangerous, yet they provided essential protection against attacking fighters. Many gunners sacrificed their lives defending the aircraft and pilot beside them. For both crew members, survival often depended on the strength of the Sturmovik itself. The armored fuselage absorbed impacts that would have destroyed ordinary aircraft. Bullet holes peppered the wings. Shrapnel tore into the body of the plane. And still it flew. In quiet moments after returning from battle, pilots would walk around their aircraft and count the damage. Sometimes dozens of bullet holes marked the metal surface. Mechanics would patch them carefully, preparing the aircraft for another mission the next day. These pilots did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as soldiers in a desperate struggle for survival. Yet their courage in the sky would become one of the defining legends of the Eastern Front. Part 5 at the turning of the war. As the tide of war slowly shifted against Germany, the Sturmovik became an instrument of relentless pressure on retreating forces. Soviet offensives across the Eastern Front relied heavily on air support to break enemy defenses and disrupt supply lines. When German units attempted to withdraw, columns of vehicles crowded narrow roads and bridges. These moments created perfect opportunities for Il-2 formations. The aircraft descended upon retreating convoys with devastating effect, destroying vehicles and creating massive traffic jams that dropped entire divisions. The psychological effect was profound. German soldiers learned to fear the distinctive engine sound of the Sturmovik. When it appeared overhead, men abandoned vehicles and scattered for cover. Anti-aircraft guns fired desperately into the sky, but the aircraft continued its relentless attacks. In major offensives such as the battles that followed Kursk, the Il-2 played a crucial role in weakening German armored units before ground forces engaged them. By destroying fuel trucks and supply vehicles, the aircraft often crippled enemy mobility long before tanks met on the battlefield. This combination of ground and air coordination transformed the nature of warfare on the Eastern Front. Soviet commanders increasingly integrated Sturmovik units directly into their operational planning. Air power was no longer separate from the battlefield, it was embedded within it. By the later years of the war, entire waves of Il-2 aircraft could appear above the battlefield, sweeping across enemy lines like storms of steel and fire. Their presence symbolized the growing momentum that Germany could no longer stop. Part 6: A legacy of the flying tank. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent, the Il-2 Sturmovik had already secured its place in history. Few aircraft embodied the brutal reality of the Eastern Front more completely than this armored machine. Built for survival, built for destruction, it had carried thousands of pilots through one of the most devastating conflicts humanity had ever known. The statistics alone were staggering. Tens of thousands of aircraft produced. Millions of combat sorties flown. Entire armored divisions slowed or destroyed under its attacks. Yet numbers could never fully capture the deeper meaning of the aircraft's legacy. For Soviet soldiers on the ground, the Sturmovik had often meant hope in moments of desperation. When enemy tanks threatened to overwhelm defensive lines, the sudden roar of engines overhead signaled that help had arrived. Steel wings slicing through smoke and cloud became a symbol that the fight was not yet lost. For the pilots who flew it, the aircraft was both protector and weapon. They trusted the armored shell that surrounded them, knowing it might be the only thing standing between life and death. Every mission demanded courage beyond measure. Many never returned. Today, the Il-2 stands not just as a piece of military technology but as a reminder of the extraordinary human effort behind wartime innovation. It represented the determination of a nation fighting for survival, the ingenuity of engineers who turned steel and engines into weapons of resistance, and the courage of pilots who faced impossible odds. Even decades later, the legend of the flying tank still echoes through history. It reminds us that in war, machines may shape battles, but it is the people inside them who define the story. And in the dark skies above the Eastern Front, few stories were written as fiercely as the one carried on the wings of the Sturmovik.